I'm working on a study on climate change and child labor in Vietnam. I'm working with Simon Feeney and Anh Trinh, who are both at RMIT University as myself. The study essentially looks at whether climate change is likely to increase child labor in the future. So how does this work? Well, basically, Vietnam is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change. It is amongst the 5 most vulnerable countries according to the World Bank. And at the same time, 1 in 10 Vietnamese children are currently working. So what we want to do is think, well, if Vietnam is going to be more vulnerable to climate change, are more children going to be working in Vietnam? So what we do is we collect data from the Young Lives Project, which is a repeated cross-section or panel from the World Bank. And then we compare these data to data on basically rainfall on a small grid system. What we can do is see basically how much rainfall is falling within a particular area of Vietnam, and then compare it to household choices in terms of whether children are entering or exiting work. We find that households that experience an increase or greater than expected rainfall are likely to send their children to work. Children are more likely to work in the agricultural sector, and they're more likely to work in household chores. This is generally the same across both boys and girls, but there is some evidence that boys are more likely to work in agriculture, while girls are more likely to work in household chores, highlighting a division of labor early on, which is common in this literature. One of the other things that we do in this paper is look at very big shocks. So basically what we want to do is look at whether rain is greater than average, but whether rain is a lot greater than average. And what we do in this case is look at rain that's greater than 1 standard deviation from the mean. We find that when rain is greater than average, as I said, children are more likely to work. When it's a lot greater than average, there is evidence that children are less likely to work in agriculture and more likely to work in non-agricultural activities. This includes things like making handicrafts, peacemaking, etc. So at the end of the day, climate change is likely to pull children into work, increasingly into different types of work. And so households in Vietnam, and particularly the Vietnamese government, needs to be prepared for this. So what are some things the Vietnamese government can do now to help households deal with this issue? The number one issue is, of course, that if households are pulling workers from their own sort of family, using little children to work, then the main thing is this may be occurring in a place like Vietnam because there's a lot of restrictions on whether households can access labor from different zones. Vietnam has a system called the Ho Cao system, which basically prevents different workers to coming into different zones. And as a result, it makes the labor market very inflexible. This potentially can lead households to ask their children to work. Also, if households are asking children to work as a result of climatic shocks, it may be useful for them to have some access to credit so that they can get some funding to either hire more workers. If shocks are very large, then households may be asking children to leave some sort of work, i.e. the agricultural sector, and work in other sectors. And if that's the case, then what we need is some sort of insurance, the provision of credit, as well as the provision of different insurance schemes at the national level, which are already available in Vietnam, but coupling these two areas that are a lot more vulnerable to climate change may be useful. So at the end of the day, what the study tries to do is basically look at a couple of very simple stories about how households deal with environmental shocks, and at the same time look at the use of labor, particularly child labor within the household, and then come up with some simple strategies that may reduce the amount of child labor that is being employed, where we find some sort of labor market reform and access to insurance being the most important drivers.